Before I begin my paper, I just want to mention the three sources that I focused on in writing this paper. The first one is Otto Friedrich Bollnow and his book Das Wesen der Stimmungen, or the nature of moods or Stimmungen. I'll be using the word Stimmung throughout my presentation. So, if you recall from what Malte Brinkmann said, it designates a long-lasting type of mood or feeling. Another book that I used was, that I relied on, was Hubert Tellenbach's book, Geschmack und Atmosphäre. It's quite a brilliant book, short little book actually. I highly recommend it. And then a third source was Atmosphere's Aesthetics of Emotional Spaces by Italian Antonio Grifero. So, I'll begin though with Bollnow. Bollnow, at one point in his Nature of Stimmungen, said that in every Stimmung, the world is already interpreted or ausgelegt in a very particular way, and all understanding is always already guided by this original interpretation of life and world in a Stimmung. There are thus certain kinds of knowledge that human beings cannot gain on their own accord, try as they might. Rather, such knowledge dawns upon them only in a Stimmung suitable to it. This is a key quote in my paper, and in this paper I focus on, in some ways, the epistemological characteristics of Stimmungen and the temporality of different types of Stimmungen. So a specific Stimmung, a sustained mood or disposition, Bollnow is saying, is something that lays out or interprets life in the world in its own particular way. All subsequent understanding is guided by it. This means that there are certain understandings that we cannot gain on our own. Such knowledge can only arise or open up, aufgehen, only in the right atmosphere. So here, Bollnow, as in his other existentialist works, is both building on and critiquing the work of his former teacher, who was Martin Heidegger. Heidegger himself characterized Stimmung as nothing less than existentially constitutive of our openness to the world. He said it is primordially disclosive of the world itself. Heidegger also speaks of a gestimmtes sich befinden, meaning that Stimmung is also constitutive of Dasein's openness to itself. It has a reflexive character and potential as well. A given Stimmung can thus be said to be the ground on which any knowing, self-knowledge, or experience appears as figure. So kind of a figure-ground relationship, but different from a figure-ground relationship in other ways, as I will show. As Heidegger himself puts it, it is the how or the way, in German, the wie, of our being, and importantly, of our being with one another. And Heidegger says that Stimmungen are themselves precisely a fundamental manner and fundamental way of being, indeed of being there, and this always directly includes being with one another. So what Heidegger is saying is that Stimmungen, in this sustained sense, is very often, or perhaps always, a question of atmosphere. It's not just something that we carry within us, but rather something that fills a space, as Malte Brinkmann said, and that is shared. Now this results in a number of characteristics for atmosphere and for Stimmungen, and I'll be describing those. So, but first what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about what I call the epistemology of the atmospheric. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about how we know an atmosphere, how we recognize ourselves to be immersed in a particular atmosphere, a particular feeling or mood, and what we can know and what we can't know about it, because it's a very tricky question. Even if atmosphere is the elusive ground to the figure of our understanding, we still know ourselves to be affected by an atmosphere or a Stimmung. But our knowledge of a Stimmung or an atmosphere is of a special kind. Following Gernot Böhme and Friedrich Buitendijk, who describe smells, above all, as atmospheric more than any other sense phenomenon, I will now provide a brief account of our knowledge of the atmospheric, specifically in relationship to our sense of smell. Imagine, if you will, arriving at home or waking up in the morning to the smell of fresh baking bread. Or imagine being on vacation and feeling and smelling a fresh ocean breeze. In these types of experience of atmosphere and of smell, we are immersed and we are also receptive. We are receiving something. At the same time, though, we're not passive. So when we smell something, when we're participating in something and feeling a particular, of ourselves to be surrounded by a particular, or dominated by a particular atmosphere, we are involved and active in these atmospheres. Through smell, we literally breathe in, breathe out, communicate, and become involved with the atmosphere that surrounds us. Atmosphere in this sense, and as Tellenbach explains, coalesces the subject with the world. The word he uses is verschmelzt. So in some ways, we become part of the world around us. Our separateness from the world is greatly diminished. At the same time, though, smell is the most involuntary and also the least intellectual of our senses. It belongs to the field of lower sensuality, as Tellenbach puts it. This is a place where, quote, there exists no concrete image of memory or imagination, but only aesthetic experiences. So this is an aspect of smell and also of the atmospheric, where which fits into, which really shows it to be very much different from that which is intellectual and rational, that which is identifying and analyzing and picking apart. Rather, its atmosphere is something that is actually synthetic and whole. Perhaps because of its unrepresentable but monolithic character, smell, like atmosphere, has a subtle and powerful relationship with memory. Walter Benjamin has characterized scent as the inaccessible refuge of the mémoire involontaire. It is unlikely that any given smell will associate itself with a visual image, he says. Of all sensual impressions, it will ally itself only with the same scent. So not only is smell and atmosphere something that doesn't have a concrete image or isn't involved in imagination, as Tellenbach was saying, but it also is something that communicates and associates itself just on the level of feeling, of the atmospheric, of Stimmung. This makes it all the more elusive. Smells can be reminiscent of diverse places and experiences, whether of an old classroom or, for example, of somebody's particular perfume. And this can cause us to be flooded with memories, sometimes taking us far back in time. Like atmospheres themselves, these nostalgic smells can sometimes give us the strange sense of reliving a previous experience, of the uncanny familiarity of déjà vu or of the unheimlich. Bollnow, who emphasizes that every particular Stimmung has its own temporal structure, its own particular experience of time, describes this kind of atmospheric nostalgia or atmospheric anamnesis as a coalescence, fusion, or again Verschmelzung of the present moment that we are experiencing the smell or this sort of sense of atmosphere with the past. But however palpable this connection might be, atmospheres, like smells, are not about any one thing in particular. As I already mentioned, there is no specific image that's associated with them. They have no distinct visual, audible, or semantic correlative. The noise of a first grade classroom just after recess, or the tension in the room where students are writing an exam, hardly points to a single clear meaning or understanding. Tonio Grafero says that an atmosphere is in this sense presents a logos in statu nascendi. So a logos that is in a state of becoming or emerging. And if any atmosphere were to go beyond this emergent or nascent condition, it would simply cease to be an atmosphere anymore. But unlike smells, an atmosphere can be cultivated, sustained, and extended. From the perspective of the observer, this occurs largely through habit and mimesis. So a question was asked earlier about how we can work with emotions and cultivate them, and what kind of work, emotional work, would be something that we would do, say, in a workplace. Well, one of the first things I would say in response to that would be a question. It could start off as a question of cultivating habits, in which are visible and which have an emotional quality. So other examples of these types of behaviors would be something like clapping, applause, or laughter. Think of the infectious nature of laughter, for example, or think of the enthusiasm of those who jump to their feet for a standing ovation, or conversely, of one's sense of obligation when it comes to joining in polite or even forced applause. These things are all a question of mimesis, of polite or genuinely expressive habit. They are, in these and other senses, also atmospheric. Speaking specifically of shared laughter, Bollnow again gives emphasis to its hermeneutic dimension. He describes it as follows. It is a process of coming into contact, or Kontaktgewinnung, between individuals that starts immediately. They understand each other in their approval. It is as if there is a kind of feeling that they are confidants. In other words, there are people who are in on the joke. There is in this enjoyment a characteristic that one cannot at all resist, even if one wants to. Laughter, applause, and other nonverbal forms of communication play a central role in the short video clip that I now consider. Just a bit about the clip. This clip is from an all-boys middle school classroom of about 15 students in Innercity Detroit. And the instructional focus that's going on here is on complex sentences. These are sentences that use a conjunction, as you probably know, to join a dependent with an independent clause. So it's basically just about how to create the types of sentences that one uses in writing and the particular grammatical parts and rules that are involved in composing such a sentence. In introducing this topic, the teacher gets one particular student, Jeremy, to answer most of her questions. She undertakes all of this initial question and answer from her desk, projecting her voice and gesturing. So.
Complex sentences. What is a complex sentence, somebody? Look on page 28. Jeremy? Just tell me what it is, Jeremy. First of all, how many parts does it have? Has 2 parts, doesn't it, Jeremy? Okay, what is one part of a complex sentence? It's an independent, what else? Clock. Oh, I got a lot to tell your dad. Look at you, Jeremy. I got a lot to tell your dad. Shut up. I like that. It's an independent clause. What's the other part? Come on, Jeremy. Pull it out, Jeremy. Come on, get this last little part. What's? Ooh, that gets your A today, class. That gets your A. Right there. Jeremy got your A for you. Jeremy got your A. Jeremy got your A for you. Go on.
Okay, so that's the clip. I'm not showing this because I think it's an example of the greatest teaching strategy you can use. I'm showing it because I want to point out the type of emotional communication that's going on here. But first I have to start this PowerPoint again, so. Yeah. So like I said, this is a clip from a school in Innercity Detroit. I think that that if we think about the conditions of Innercity Detroit, we need to make some adjustments in terms of what our expectations for teaching and learning might be. One of the things that's interesting in this clip, just as a quick example, is that the teacher tells Jeremy that she will tell her dad all about it, his dad all about it. So in a black inner city community, typically dads are not around. They're in jail or they're doing something else. So even the fact that Jeremy has a dad to be told about this is significant. So my point is to look at the affective or even aesthetic qualities of the many verbal and nonverbal communications of both students and teacher. And let me list a few of them for you. So for example, one can identify 2 points of shared clapping or applause in this clip. The first time the teacher initiates it from her desk, as you can see in this screen capture, and the second time it seems to be initiated by the student who's sitting behind Jeremy, which suggests, however indirectly, that as Bono says, they understand each other and their approval. In both cases, no one is applauding alone. There's also an episode of laughter that comes from Jeremy's corner of the classroom. And when the camera turns to this area, it shows Jeremy's neighbors to be attentive and supported. Now, I couldn't hear it from the audio, but Jeremy's fellow students thank him twice for him getting an A for the class. I have no idea what that actually means for the class as a whole, but Jeremy is positioned by the teacher as the person responsible for this really favorable outcome for the class. And one of his neighbors offers him a hand, and then he goes and shows this victory sign as well, right? The teacher repeats 7 different verbal forms of congratulations within 70 seconds and uses the collective you for all of you in the class 6 times. 6 times, yes. These and other repetitions underscore the regular, iterative, habitual, and mimetic nature of both the teacher's and the student's affective involvement. The students seem comfortable with this. It's not as if they're immersed in a type of atmosphere that is foreign or strange to them or that they're attempting to decipher. The students instead are invited and are participating in a kind of rhythmic game. There's a kind of spontaneous but cadenced communication that's in evidence here. And as befits both an atmosphere and a game, the students appear indeed to be taken up by what's happening in the classroom. And they can be said to be coalesced parts within a larger quasi-aesthetic process or flow. The rhythmic and the ludic nature of this involvement forms the playful background now against which the figure of understanding can arise. The mood in this classroom, in other words, is the way that both the class interrelates. So to borrow from Heidegger, it's eine Grundweise des Miteinanderseins. It's a fundamental way of being with one another, namely in the form of mutual support and congratulation. It is also the way that Jeremy finds himself, his gestimmtes sich befinden, the way he understands himself and finds himself in the world, his Befindlichkeit, namely as somebody who is supported and somebody who is successful. And he does so not only in the eyes of his teacher, and maybe later in the eyes of his father, but also of the peers in the classroom who repeat expressions of gratitude for him. So now I'm going to look at this clip more sort of analytically. Given that every particular Stimmung has its own temporal structure, as I quoted Bollnow as saying, the Stimmung in this classroom is obviously very different from the atmospheric nostalgia that I described above. So it's not about experiencing, maybe perhaps triggered by a smell, but in any case, re-experiencing an atmosphere or a mood or an experience that one underwent sometime in the past. Rather, the temporal orientation of the mood that's in this classroom is precisely the opposite. It is orientation that connects the present and the future. It is a mood, in Bollnow's terms, that is a happy, bright, felicitous, or in German, glückliche Stimmung. And Bono describes this Stimmung further in his Wesen der Stimmungen, not in contrast to moods focusing on the past, but through a critique of Heidegger's notion of Angst as the only fully developed basic affective mode in being and time. So this is one of Bollnau's main critiques of Heidegger, is that Heidegger's analysis of Dasein in being and time focused only on the mood of Angst and viewed all other emotional experience really as effectively experiences of inauthenticity. And so Bollnau insists that the experience of time accessible through Angst, namely one's resolute facing of one's own death, eventual death, hardly provides a complete anthropological picture and is not sufficient for understanding what happens in education, which is something with which Bollnau was constantly concerned. So this is what Bollnau says then in regard to Heidegger and the felicitous Stimmung. The present moment need no longer stand remote and isolated at the point of decision, point of resoluteness. Instead, it is integrated into a temporally unifying continuity in the context of a greater whole. And the future is now no longer something that hangs over one as a threatening fate that requires a decisive response. Instead, the present appears as an infinitely extended horizon, one that offers itself through the timeless perpetuation of one's present felicitous condition. So in other words, present and past become, again, the word used by Bollnau is verschmelzt, to become fused together. And this has particular and very significant characteristics from the perspective of pedagogy. So the glückliche Stimmung then binds us not with the past, but with the future. It connects us seamlessly with what is to come, and it expands our view of this future to constitute the widest of horizons. Time is no longer the story of our inescapable morality. Instead, it is the recognition of our potentiality and our possibility. And this interconnection of present and future gives us the first distinctly pedagogical characteristic of this Stimmung. And to describe this, I turn to Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher points out that every pedagogical influence, every pedagogical act on the part of an adult or teacher or older or responsible person presents itself as the sacrifice of a present moment for a future one. Pedagogy inevitably involves a tension between the child's fulfillment in the present and his or her eventual need to address the demands of the future. In this context, it becomes the educator's task to reconcile these opposed temporalities, the moment of enjoyment in the present and the demand of the future, and to merge present fulfillment with future demands. So here's what Schleiermacher says. This task is to see that even when the life of the child is interrupted in this way in a period of education, it or the child is ethically treated as an end in itself, and the pedagogical influence or interruption becomes the satisfaction of the child's very way of being. The Stimmung in evidence in the video, then, is one in which the students are led to believe that they both can and will succeed. It is one in which they are able to appreciate the strains of what Schleiermacher refers to as the pedagogical exercise in the present, and also in which they are able to rejoice, as Schleiermacher says, in the exercise for what it is. It becomes an end in itself. Of course, for Bollnau, this future-oriented temporal structure, this felicitous Stimmung, brings with it its own epistemology and hermeneutics. So in his book, The Nature of Stimmungen, Bollnau is constantly focusing on basically the knowledge, the hermeneutic aspect that is offered to us by any Stimmung. So felicitous Stimmungen in the plural, Bollnau says, not only lighten perception, but also make possible qualitatively new insights that belong to this Stimmung, that no longer need to be verified through a critical thinking that is grounded in its own particular underlying Stimmung. So Bono's identifying multiple types of long-lasting moods and atmospheres that are associated with different ways of thinking, different ways of knowing. So in this lightened perception that isn't verified through critical thought, it is one that can only be reached through these felicitous Stimmungen. Only in this way do these bright Stimmungen prove themselves to be an organ that opens up new knowledge, eine neue Erkenntnisse erschließendes Organ. The fact that there is knowledge that can only dawn on one when in a good mood is no secret to psychology and educational psychology. Such a mood is said to, quote, broaden or expand the breadth of attentional selection, such that the information that is around one that might be useful to the task at hand becomes more accessible for use. That's what psychology says about, being in a good mood while you're working. But with Bono's phenomenological perspective and with Schleiermacher's pedagogical perspective, we can see that there's much more going on here than just the question of information and efficient use of it. There's much more than this. And this is involved, or this brings us to a second potentially pedagogical attribute that comes to light when the video and the mood it captures is seen in relationship to what Kant says in particular about the paradox of freedom and educational constraint. Kant asks in his famous question, how am I to develop a sense of freedom in the child in spite of necessary educational constraints and restraints? So Kant's famous question asks about how does the child eventually learn to become free and autonomous by being in many ways constrained and restrained in his or her education. As Bono points out, this felicitous Stimmung entails not only an apparent freedom from future obstacles, but it also presupposes what he calls an inner satisfaction, an actual freedom from immediate wants and demands. So one can only engage in a felicitous Stimmung or share in one if you're not hungry or in pain or otherwise constrained or suffering. As Bono points out, there needs to be an actual freedom from immediate wants and demands in order for us to see things in terms of their own nature or Wesen. So we can only get at the essence of something that we're considering if our awareness is no longer preoccupied by our own selves. Only makes sense. This freedom, moreover, is reinforced in the indeterminate nature of what we can know about any given Stimmung or atmosphere. As Grifero said, in the atmosphere embodies a logos that is perpetually in statu nascendi. To return now for a moment to Tellenbach and his analysis of smell, one could say that the freedom implied in such an atmosphere is like taking a deep, vitalizing breath of fresh air, a moment in which, quote, one feels oneself in accord with the world, elevated, expanded, and freed. Here, the mode of communication, Tellenbach continues, stands in continuous correspondence with the mode of freedom, specifically as conviviality or Geselligkeit. Both the teacher's effusive praise and the student's own congratulations attest to a conviviality in the video example that is clearly focused on Jeremy's freedom. Even though Jeremy's contributions and answers are minimal and fairly formal, the teacher leaves no doubt, both through her words and their tone, that she sees his actions as exercises in responsibility and in individual achievement. And in this sense, she makes it clear that they're also expressions of his freedom as well. So to conclude, I'm going to just discuss a third pedagogical aspect very briefly. This third aspect can be found in what is perhaps the weakness of the video that I just showed you, specifically as a pedagogical example. This is the emphatic, even extreme degree of the teacher's congratulation and celebration of Jeremy's very modest accomplishments. He just reads a couple of words from the textbook. By leading us to wonder whether her praise, the teacher's praise, might be ill-judged or indiscriminate. I mean, is she just praising for the sake of praising students and making everybody feel good? The teacher's words may be taken as endangering the very atmosphere that she has helped to cultivate. The danger here is that the Stimmung ceases to be a logos in statu nascendi, that it is no longer emergent, but rather that it finds its correlate in the very determinate image and imagination of the teacher's deliberate plans and goals. So maybe she's manipulating the class. Seeing the felicitous or glückliche Stimmung in this way runs the risk of breaking the temporal and convivial bonds of this atmosphere and revealing the harsh reality of an experienced sacrifice of the present moment for a future one. To borrow Schleiermacher's language, and that Schleiermacher sees as being a necessary part of any pedagogical influence or interaction or intervention. However, I believe that this points to the risk evident not only in this classroom, but in any pedagogical situation that should be blessed by a similar atmosphere. And this is the idea that the students in the class may be experiencing, or the teacher would like them to be experiencing, nothing less than the realization of a future possibility in the present moment. And to work towards this is always to teach in extremis, and I think to always be at the edge of, or to very often be at the edge of an atmosphere changing into something else. Thank you very much.